The ice continent is calling to the brave, the curious, and the tourists from afar. Oh, cute!
I visited Antarctica 5 years ago, and the boat I was on, a third of them were Chinese tourists. And we visited the Great Wall Station, which is the first Antarctic research station of China.
Thousands of Chinese tourists visited Antarctica each year pre-pandemic for the ice, wedding photos, or simply novelty. Unfortunately, the ABC won't send me. Something about wasting taxpayers' money? I don't know. So apparently the next best thing is this green screen and speaking to someone who has been.
It's a bit like bragging rights. Everyone loves penguins. Penguins and seals.
Yunjiang has not only been to Antarctica, she's an expert on China and has written about the ambitions in the region, which are growing.
China only went to Antarctica in the 80s, and its first trip to Antarctica was actually with an Australian team. After its initial trip, it started building its own research stations and then joined the Antarctic Treaty.
So what is this Antarctic Treaty? Okay, let's put this green screen to good use. The Antarctic Treaty, signed by 12 countries in 1959, establishes that no single country owns Antarctica. The deal struck allows countries to conduct scientific research but not military activities. China joined in the 1980s under the same terms. The Antarctic Treaty helps keep the status quo and now has 54 members.
China, I think it also needs to be acknowledged as being fairly significantly engaged in the Antarctic Treaty System.
This is Professor Donald Rothwell, who has dedicated his life to international law of the sea and polar regions. He has sadly never been to Antarctica.
So China actually has got quite a bit of credibility in terms of its Antarctic scientific research program, its Antarctic diplomatic program, and it's certainly a fully engaged player in the Antarctic Treaty System.
China is now building its fifth base, a third icebreaker, and reportedly the world's largest crew fishing vessel.
For China, one of its biggest priorities when it comes to Antarctica is access to potential resources. We're talking about things like fisheries. And another really increasingly important issue is climate change.
The Antarctic is meant to be neutral territory, but that hasn't prevented geopolitical tensions impacting the atmosphere.
China's increasing power has caused some friction with the existing established powers, that is true, including with Australia. It wants to have more of a say in a lot of international negotiations in Antarctic governance.
I think there's a bit of unease as to why China, who is not a traditional Antarctic or even a polar state, is investing so much into its Antarctic diplomacy, in terms of its Antarctic scientific program, partly because of this uncertainty and ambiguity in terms of what exactly are China's goals and strategies.
They don't share the same objectives as Australia as a treaty nation when it comes to protecting Antarctica.
The previous Morrison government pledged $800 million right before the recent election to invest in surveillance drones, helicopters and other vehicles to shore up Australia's presence in Antarctica. This put China on the offence, who say they are abiding by the treaty.
As Morrison continues to whine about the threat of China ahead of a looming federal election in the country, he seems to have directly tied the Antarctic plan to Australia's national security.
Under the treaty, military personnel and equipment are allowed, but this must be declared. There are allegations of some level of undeclared military activity by China, but other experts say it's difficult to verify. But again, China's transparency is the issue.
A spotlight has been shone on some of China's activities by a number of researchers and scholars, but there's not necessarily a great deal of clarity about that, partly because some of those activities may well be entirely legitimate, but also because there's not a lot of transparency about what some of China's activities are.
So, what's the new government's take? The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade says,
We are not aware of any contravention of the treaty's non-militarization provision.
for now, the treaty holds and the status quo remains.
China is not the dominant power. So it is quite restrained in what it can do.
But as geopolitical tensions simmer, scientists and tourists on the continent carry on with their adventures. Right, Penguin?
One more time, and on your left, maybe this time. Other side left.